In your journey and dreams to acquire your first AP Royal Oak, there has been many times you are thinking which size of Royal Oak to buy between 37mm and 41mm and which one will fit better for you. I know that feeling. I've been through it. So let's dive into the comparison between these two Royal Oaks and see what are the differences that may make one of these two Royal Oaks a better option for you personally. And let's not just look at the differences in terms of dimensions and figures, but also which one will fit you better. Both of these watches are Royal Oaks, and the most obvious and defined difference is the size, with 15450 being 37mm and 15400 being 41mm. In this particular video, the 37mm Royal Oak I have is also two-tone with gold accent to it, but we will not primarily be looking at the difference from steel to two-tone perspective, although I'll touch base on it briefly towards the end of this video. Let's first start with the similarities in these two watches. Both of these Royal Oaks come with grand tapestry pattern, which slips between petite tapestry on 39mm jumbo and has smaller scales in the dial, and then the mega tapestry pattern, which is on the offshore models and has much bigger scales than you see in these dials. Both of these watches maintain the design proportions and relativities, and you can see that the length of dial hands, including the hour, minute and seconds hand, is shorter in 37mm Royal Oak compared to 41mm Royal Oak, where the hands are longer. As the aspect ratio is the same, you can see that the same gap between the hour hand and hour markers is maintained. And then the minute and seconds hand in both watches also go halfway through to the minute markings in the dials of both of these watches. Both watches come with screwed-on crown to offer 50 meters of water resistance. Starting with the differences, the first noticeable difference in the dial is the hour markers that are much shorter on 15450. Many times when you see someone posting a wrist shot with Royal Oak, and you can't gauge if they are wearing the 41mm Royal Oak or 37mm Royal Oak, here's the trick for you to identify the model. The hour marker at 3 o'clock tells you what size Royal Oak that is. On 15450, this hour marker at 3 o'clock is almost like a small dot, whereas on 15400, the same hour marker before the date window is about 5 times its length than its width, making it look like a proper stick hour marker as opposed to dot hour marker at 3 o'clock on 37mm Royal Oak. While the difference in the size is one aspect that changes the experience of the watch on the wrist, what I personally find as bigger difference between these Royal Oaks is the size of the bracelet. I personally think the 37mm case size is fine too and does not look small, but it's the bracelet that appears to be slightly on the smaller side on the same 37mm Royal Oak. The 15400 comes with 26mm wide bracelet at the case, whereas on 15450 the bracelet width at the case is 23mm, and this is a considerable difference, but both bracelets marry very well with the watches regardless. The bracelet on 15400 then tapers down to 18mm at the clasp, whereas on 15450 the bracelet tapers down to 16mm, and that's another area where the bracelet does feel a little narrow. So where the 41mm Royal Oak has a wider bracelet to go with the larger case, the 37mm Royal Oak has a narrower bracelet, and you do feel the difference when you wear them. That being said, if either of these is going to be your first Royal Oak, you simply won't see any issues in the sizes of the bracelets regardless. And the reason I find the 37mm bracelet a little narrow is because I'm used to wearing the wider bracelet on 41mm Royal Oak. And then the 39mm Royal Oak also has the same 26mm wide bracelet at the case, although it tapers down to the same 16mm at the clasp as 15450. For reference, Rolex Submariner bracelet is 20mm at the case and 17mm at the clasp, so the bracelet on 15450 is still wider than Submariner at the case, but a tad narrower at the clasp. But given that Royal Oak is naturally an integrated bracelet watch, you would rather want a wider bracelet, so you can't really compare it with the bracelet on Submariner. Turning the watches upside down further explains how the 15400 is overall a much wider watch, and not just at the case, rather the wider bracelet then further spreads its wings across the wrist. Both watches come with the same AP in-house caliber 3120, to offer 22-karat solid yellow gold rotor and 60 hours of power reserve. As the movement is the same, you can see that the caliber fits much tighter on 15450 case, whereas if you compare it with 15400, the movement appears a tad smaller. Although I personally find the case spec proportions on 15400 absolutely fine, but it's subjective. For your reference, the same 3120 movement is also fitted in 42mm offshore models. And even with the bigger cases of offshore models than the 41mm Royal Oak, it still looks fine to me. Since the movement is the same on both of these watches, both 37 and 41mm Royal Oaks then come with the case that has the same thickness of 9.8mm. Although both watches at 9.8mm are very thin watches already, but 15400 looks a tad thinner in the wrist experience due to its larger size. You can see that even the bezel shares the same thickness on both of these watches. Now I'll tell you which one of these watches may be the right fit for you when you factor in your wrist size. Although on paper and dimensionally, the 37mm Royal Oak would veer 4mm shorter than the 15400, which is 41mm. In reality, it veers around 6mm shorter. And the reason for this is that the bracelet flares out a little further on the 15400 than it does on the 15450. I'm not too sure if this is due to the angle of the lugs or clearances of the bracelet, but if you heard during all these years that Royal Oaks were larger than their actual size is, you heard it correct. If you have seen my previous reviews with the wrist shots on my 6.5 inches wrist, what I always state is the wrist span, which is how wide my wrist actually is. When you buy a watch, case size is pretty much one aspect that suggests how large or small the watch will wear. But what matters at the end of the day is the minimum span of the watch with its lugs and bracelet. And that number should always be smaller than your wrist size, so the watch can hug your wrist and contour as per your wrist profile rather than cantilevering over your wrist. So coming back to wrist span of 15400, although the watch case is 41mm, the minimum span on it is massive 55mm. Which means that even if you have a wrist size of 6.5 inches like mine, it will be a larger watch for you if your wrist span is less than 55mm. I'm on the borderline for this watch as 55mm is exactly my wrist span, so 15400 works fine for me and hugs the wrist as it should. And then if you have a wrist span of more than 55mm, that's even better. Whereas if you compare it with 15450, although the size of the watch case is 37mm, the wrist span of the watch is 49mm, which although does still sound like a larger number, yet it is 6mm shorter in size than 41mm Royal Oak. So if you find the Rolex ceramic sub to be the right fit for your wrist, the 37mm Royal Oak may be the one for you. And this is purely because the ceramic sub lug to lug is also the same 49mm. But if you wanted a Royal Oak that is bigger and more present on the wrist than ceramic sub Mariner, then the 41mm Royal Oak is your answer between the pair. The 37mm Royal Oak I have in this comparison is also two-tone, and the 41mm Royal Oak is all steel. The difference between these is that the two-tone Royal Oak comes with the pink gold bezel and crown, and then the hour markers and the dial hands are also of the same pink gold. The center connecting links of the bracelet on the two-tone are also of pink gold as opposed to 41mm Royal Oak, which has the bezel, crown and bracelet fully made of steel. And the hour markers and the dial hands are then of white gold, and accordingly there are no yellow or pink accents on all steel Royal Oak. There is no wrong choice between these two watches, and essentially these are the same watches with the only difference in the size. And then although the difference in the size on paper is 4mm, the difference on the wrist wear is actually 6mm. So if you ever tried 15400 and found it a little too big, and you don't have the access to get hold of 39mm jumbo, or if it's too delicate for your day-to-day use, then the 37mm Royal Oak is the one for you. If you still want a louder and a more wrist-present watch, all the way from the case to the clasp due to wider bracelet, then the 41mm Royal Oak is the one for you. But if you wanted to experience AP feel, yet wanted to keep it a little understated, and was intending to add Royal Oak as more of a casual or dressier watch, the 15450 may be the right match for you. For me personally, I like my watch to fill the wrist both horizontally and vertically, so 15400 is my pick of the pair. But when you consider aesthetics, balance of proportions, and then the historical significance, if I can only have one Royal Oak, it will be none of them, because it will be the 39mm Jumbo.